finally said no to something. Maybe it was a request you didn't have the energy for. Maybe it was a plan you genuinely couldn't make. Maybe it was just a moment where you chose yourself, quietly, reasonably, without drama. And then almost immediately, something shifted inside you. Not relief, not peace, guilt. A slow, uncomfortable feeling that you did something wrong, that you were too much, that you hurt someone, that maybe you should take it back, soften it, apologize for it. And the strange part is, you know the boundary was reasonable. You knew it when you set it. But knowing that doesn't make the guilt go away. If that sounds familiar, this video isn't about teaching you how to set better boundaries. It's about understanding why that guilt shows up in the first place and what it's actually been protecting you from. People who feel guilty for setting boundaries usually don't struggle with knowing what they need. They're often quite self-aware. They can see clearly when something is too much, when they're being asked to give more than they have, when a situation is draining them. The struggle isn't the awareness, it's the permission. There's something inside them that finds it very difficult to act on what they know without immediately second-guessing it. So the boundary gets set, but then it gets followed by a flood of internal noise. Did I say it wrong? Was I too harsh? Are they upset with me? Should I have just said yes? And sometimes the guilt is strong enough that they undo the boundary entirely. They go back and say yes. They over-explain. They soften it so much that it stops being a boundary at all. What looks like indecisiveness from the outside is actually something much deeper happening underneath. Here's what's really going on. For a lot of people, the act of setting a boundary doesn't just feel like a decision. It feels like a declaration. Like they're saying something about the relationship, about the other person, about their own worth. And at some level, buried beneath the surface, there's a belief that's been running quietly for a long time. The belief that their needs are a problem, not a priority, not something valid, a problem. So when they set a boundary, their nervous system doesn't register it as self-respect. It registers it as conflict, as rejection, as the moment something might break. And guilt is what the brain uses to pull you back from the edge of that perceived danger. It's not a moral response. It's a protective one. This usually doesn't come from nowhere. For many people who carry this pattern, there was an earlier version of their life where their needs genuinely did create tension, where asking for something, space, rest, time, honesty, disrupted the emotional environment around them. Maybe they grew up in a household where keeping the peace was the unspoken rule, where someone else's emotions were always the loudest in the room, where being agreeable meant being loved and being difficult meant something was wrong with you. Or maybe the message wasn't that dramatic. Sometimes it was subtle. A parent who became distant when disappointed. A friendship where expressing a need led to guilt tripping. A dynamic where love always felt slightly conditional, like it depended on how little space you took up. Over time, the child in that environment learned something. They learn that their comfort matters less than the comfort of the people around them. That harmony is their responsibility. That need is a burden. And that lesson doesn't disappear when you grow up. It just gets quieter. It starts running in the background, shaping how you respond to conflict, how you interpret someone's silence after you've said no, how quickly you move to smooth things over. The guilt isn't irrational. It's the residue of a very old lesson. And here's where it gets interesting. Most people assume that guilt around boundaries is about confidence, that if you just believed in yourself more, the guilt would go away, that it's a self-esteem problem. But that's not quite it. It's not really about confidence. It's about identity. For people who grew up learning that their role was to accommodate, to keep others comfortable, to be the person who makes things easier, that role became part of who they are. It became how they measured their value. Being helpful, being available, being the person who says yes. That's not just a behavior. For a lot of people, it's their identity. So when a boundary is set, it's not just a preference being communicated. At a deeper level, it feels like a betrayal of self, like stepping outside of who they're supposed to be. The guilt is the identity trying to pull you back. And that's why logic doesn't fix it. You can know intellectually that the boundary was fair. You can tell yourself you have every right to say no, But if your sense of self is built around being the person who doesn't, the guilt will keep coming anyway, because it's not responding to facts, it's responding to identity. Over time, this pattern has a quiet but significant cost. When someone consistently overrides their own needs to manage the emotions of others, they start to lose track of what they actually want. Their inner voice gets quieter. Their preferences become harder to identify, not because they don't have them, but because they've spent so long filtering them through the question of how they'll affect other people. They become fluent in other people's emotional states and somewhat foreign to their own. And the relationships they build tend to reflect this. They often attract dynamics that confirm the old belief. Relationships where their giving is the foundation, where they are needed more than they are known, where the balance tilts quietly but consistently in one direction. Not because they chose that consciously, but because that's the role the pattern knows how to play. There's also something that happens to the body in all of this. Chronic accommodation without release doesn't just affect the mind. It creates a kind of low-level tension that lives in the chest, the throat, the stomach, a persistent low hum of unexpressed things. Some people describe it as anxiety, others as tiredness that doesn't go away with rest. It's often the physical signature of a self that has been set aside too many times. So what does all of this point to? At the core of guilt around boundaries is usually a belief, installed early, reinforced often, that one's needs are less important than the needs of others, that love is earned through availability, that taking up space is a risk. And because that belief got written into identity, not just behavior, it doesn't respond to willpower or logic alone. It responds to something slower, something more patient. It responds to the gradual, quiet experience of setting a boundary and watching the world not fall apart, of saying no and discovering that the relationship survived, of choosing yourself and finding out, maybe for the first time, that you were allowed to. That awareness doesn't change everything at once, but it changes the way you see the pattern. And once you see it clearly, where it came from, what it's been protecting, what it cost, you can't look at the guilt the same way again. It was never proof that you did something wrong. It was just a very old habit trying to keep you safe. And that awareness alone changes how you move. If this explains something for you, there's more to uncover.